Debanjali, shall we start?
Yes, ma'am. Welcome to the fourth day of Nordic Summer School. Our first speaker for today is Dr. Meri Koivusalo, who will be speaking on health policy in Finland. She is the professor of global health and development at Tampere University, Finland. Her area of specialization includes global health issues, particularly the relationship between economic globalization, trade and health, health systems and politics, and practice of global health policy making. She has worked with the Finnish government, the European Commission, and the World Health Organization Geneva, and is currently a member of the WHO Expert Panel on Science and Technology. Dr. Koivusalo is also a member of the board of the Nordic Center India. She's a deputy board member representing Finland. I would now like to request Professor Bhaswati Sarkar for the welcome address.
Thank you, Debanjali. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fourth day of the Nordic Summer School. And we have today Professor Meri Koivusalo, right? Have I got it right? Okay. As Debanjali pointed out, she's from Finland, Tampere University, and she's going to speak to us on a very important issue. And we know in this kind of a pandemic situation where we are facing not just the pandemic in terms of how it is, attacking us, the virus attacking us, but our responses, because that's very important. How do we respond to it? How our health systems respond to it? Whether we are able to cope with the kind of challenge that it poses, and at least provide minimum healthcare to our citizens. So it becomes very important. We know how important it is right now in Delhi. Professor will speak to us about health policy in Finland, and she promised that she's going to touch upon COVID, which and Finland's response to that, because we have seen that Finland has responded. It has managed the situation well compared to its neighbors also, let alone compared to us. So we need to know what has it done right. And I think when she talks about the health policy in Finland, that will give us an idea of how the policy that it already has in place creates a possibility of how it addresses new challenges and crises, how it prepares itself for crisis. So over to you, Professor. You have 30 minutes and then 15 minutes of Q&A. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Very honored to be able to kind of talking GNU. Unfortunately, it's a very long time since I've been here last time. I want to now to share the screen, and so unfortunately you'll need to kind of face with a little bit of hesitation. Can you see the screen now? Good.
Yes, ma'am, we can.
So my lecture is about the health policy in Finland, and what I'm going to talk now is about health outcomes a bit, so that you know where Finland comes, health systems and healthcare policy, public health, health protection, then a bit about the Finnish kind of approach to the health in all policies, and then lastly, but not least, about the COVID-19 situation. So if you look at Finland, I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of a kind of a ground to kind of the background in terms of the infant mortality changes, which has gone down very much. But you can see that it's not very far since that hunger and cholera have been kind of a concern, and that you can see the infant mortalities started to kind of go down furthermore, kind of solidly in the mid of the 19th century. And the second thing is, of course, the comparative approach, and you all are, you do European studies, a lot of you, so you want to know about the kind of Europe in a context. So the life expectancy in Finland is currently increasing in the sense that it's in the top third of EU countries, and in that sense, it's kind of one could say that it is going reasonably well on in terms of the life expectancy. The diseases and the causes of death display a bit of a kind of a particular picture where you've got the cancer and neoplasms, which are kind of existing but decreasing. You've got the cardiovascular diseases and related causes, and then you've got a quite kind of still a high levels of external kind of issues which relate to alcohol-related causes, accidents, and suicides, which have been kind of a focus of measures which we wanted to kind of reduce, because these are not kind of automatic, but where we've not been as good in terms of the reduction. And if you want to know everything about health system in Finland, we've got a nice kind of a contribution, which is not very old, on the describing the Finnish health system, which is kind of a publicly funded health system with 83%, with 75% is public funded, of which then majority is on taxes and Western national health insurance. We've got very few private sector full kind of capacity hospitals, and so the private sector mainly operates through kind of medical doctors and group services and occupational healthcare. In comparison to many European countries and the Nordic countries, the usual contribution to health system costs and financing is larger, and this kind of is an issue in Finland. And also in Finland, even though you've got a public provision of services and public financing of services, the services can be contracted out or outsourced by the local government, which are responsible for the services. And we also have got a national health insurance system, or national social insurance system, to put it in the kind of a right context, which pay part of the private and occupational health services. If you think about the health politics, much of the health politics have been kind of related to healthcare reforms and efforts to kind of look at the way how health systems are organized and financed. And in Finland, you've got a long tradition of local government and independence of local government, and they used to have a very much to say and independence in how to organize your health services, because we've got over 300 local governments in a 5.5 million population. Just think about 5.5 million population. I think in India it would be a local in many ways, but this is then divided into kind of larger entities. So and there has been reform efforts to re-centralize. So we want to have a 21 well-being counties, and then the main kind of one in Helsinki, and the reforms are still about the kind of a public budget, but the questions which is going to be now kind of negotiated, the government is still negotiating one proposal to reorganization, is to what extent private sector will be engaged with it, and how and what kind of rights the kind of the well-being counties will have to organize the services in general. And here's another one to kind of highlight a bit, to kind of see how the health spending per capita is done. So we are kind of in a quite good situation, in the sense that our health spending is not very high, and it's only slightly above the EU average. So at the same time, we also kind of belong to a country where the health policies have indicated that we've got a relatively low number of doctors in a European context, and relatively high number of nurses in comparison to some other European countries. You can see the letters kind of represent the different European countries in question. But this implies that the nurses have had an important role in the Finnish healthcare system. Of course, some of that is a bit kind of it might be kind of overblown as well, because a lot of nurses may not be actually practicing. They might be formally practicing, but you may have got people in the kind of maternity leave, and thus that can be kind of representing a slightly higher numbers of nurses than you might otherwise. But in the European context, it wouldn't be that much of a difference. In terms of the kind of a weak point, I think, in the Finnish healthcare system is that the financing has quite high share of out-of-pocket payments in the current context, and there have been a lot of efforts to change this, to kind of to increase the kind of a role of public spending or other ways. But it has been a practice that once it was started, it was difficult to kind of abolish. So we still have got quite large share of out-of-pocket payments of health expenditures in Finland. The sad reality is that as the social insurance is going to cover for people for the costs of the out-of-pocket, of the social kind of welfare, is covering the share of out-of-pocket payments for people who can't afford it. The result is that all the administrative efforts to kind of gather and sort this out almost kind of becomes equal to the actual costs that you gain from the out-of-pocket payment. So it has been a kind of a continuous discussion of the role and importance and challenges with out-of-pocket payments, but at the moment they still remain on hold. We've got a small share of voluntary health insurance, but it's pretty much kind of in terms of the financing, but a lot of that is concentrated on children's insurance. So the insurance corporations advertise it to middle-class families who take it for their children and hope for kind of a quicker access to specialists or medical specialists for their children. And who could deny anything, the best treatment for your children? So that is the kind of argument that a lot of parents tend to take the voluntary, the children's voluntary health insurance, but it doesn't usually cover the big ticket items. It's only for the doctor's visits. So that's why the share of the overall funding is not that great, because the biggest cost you always kind of face from the hospital costs, and that's publicly financed. So the kind of challenges for the future is the kind of a middle classes going through the kind of a private healthcare and private providers for the services through the children's insurance first, and then through occupational health insurance, which both cover doctor's appointments and not the kind of further services, but which kind of get people to using private sector services as a kind of a practice. And the second issue is a bit regressive financing system and multiple channels for financing. And the regressiveness is because of the Finnish taxation system and because of the kind of the use of the healthcare system in the sense that to the proportion of the kind of a poorest population who would need more, they would be kind of we end up kind of having VAT taxes and forms of taxes that cover part of the tax system more than those who are more affluent. We've got also the challenge of aging population, which kind of links up with the kind of elderly care. And I think that the common global problem, which is kind of exists almost in most countries, is that the remote and more rural municipalities and localities, it becomes much more difficult to secure and ensure the availability of medical doctors and to ensure the available care. So the Finland, the kind of the stamp here is about the kind of the Finnish kind of early maternal and childcare, which was kind of focused on the Finnish national policies. And it was invested, a lot of kind of resources were invested on ensuring that the children were healthy and on ensuring that the healthcare system was kind of functioning for children. Some of the kind of part of the support mechanisms also take place in the form of health and social protection through the composite health insurance and social insurance institution, which on the basis of the sickness pay can be given for 60 days on the basis of the general doctor. And then you also, from further kind of issues, you can get a pension on the ground of sickness pay. And it also pays a contribution to the private sector cost. So people who use private sector in practice get the public subsidy for that use. And they also have got something that people may have heard from the kind of international news, is the baby box, which is kind of introduced in 1949 and still is taken by the most mothers to have, instead of a cash transfer of a kind of a similar amount. We did a kind of story about a booklet about it, which is available from the kind of address on the baby box, which is a kind of a cardboard box. And in spite of being a kind of a Nordic welfare state, a lot of our first babies start their lives in the cardboard box, which is full of little goodies for the kind of mothers to be. And somehow this kind of intervention, which is in-kind intervention, and for a number of people, a very old-fashioned social intervention, has survived and been very liked within the Finnish population. The second thing that you may have also heard about is the kind of North Karelia program, which has been kind of implemented for the risk factors of non-communicable diseases, because Finland found itself that after the efforts put on the children and health of the children, they had the healthiest children and the kind of most sick adults in Europe. So you had to kind of focus on what were the factors to define why people died, and especially Finnish men died very early from non-communicable diseases and especially from heart attacks. Some of the kind of broad-based policies were started already much earlier when Finland wasn't a very rich country, and free school dinners were started already over 70 years ago. So that was something that was kind of, it became a concern because of hunger, because of necessity to look at nutrition. So they looked at nutrition and what kind of issues related to people kind of getting fed and getting enough kind of nutrition of value much earlier than kind of a healthcare system was developed. And from the background of the tradition of looking at the kind of intersectoral influences on health came the kind of a Finnish emphasis on kind of intersectoral action on health and the health in all policies approach, which has been kind of promoted within the EU. And you can see also in the books, there is a kind of account of the policies for a longer term. And this extends to housing, to kind of some of the planning activities, to kind of imposing alcohol and tobacco policies, which have been kind of done for a longer time. Emphasis on healthy schools and education in school, not only school dinners, but as well kind of in terms of how health promoting schools are. and putting a lot of value on the local governments as key actors in promoting health. And just to kind of provide a kind of a reflection, so in terms of the health protection and promotion of public health, the water and sanitation with have been kind of for a long time, but we've got the problem of aging infrastructure, which is going to kind of give us a kind of a concern in future. Our drinking water is to a large extent surface water, which we would expect from the country of 1,000 lakes, but which creates then kind of challenges and necessity to keep those water sources clean and possible to be used for drinking water. We've got very low levels of air pollution, and assumption is and concern currently in terms of the determinants of health is about obesity, as well as mental health issues, because even though Finland may have got big kind of glory in terms of being defined the happiest country in the world, the increasing health issues, mental health issues remain a concern. And they started to rise in the sense of the first kind of around was perhaps in the 1990s after the kind of Finnish economic crisis, which was in Finland and some of the European countries, and Finland went into a very kind of a larger perhaps than normal other countries into recession, which kind of then resulted in kind of a perhaps a longer term struggling with the kind of a generation in terms of getting jobs, in terms of a kind of a finding their place, and especially those who were in the kind of a lowest payment levels were kind of were found to kind of a struggle, and we could see that health inequalities expanded, and in comparison to their kind of highest income groups, which were kind of doing much better in the 1990s and 2000s. So you can see that I mean the differences are not that large, and of course there is a question about detection levels and how much you put emphasis and recognize, and where it's recognizable, where it's possible to kind of put emphasis on the mental health issues. But definitely there is a kind of a question to what extent the overall context of economic policies have contributed a kind of a dark shadow over mental health and inequalities in health in a bit longer term. And here you see that the gap in life expectancy in 2016 is still in the European kind of way. It's not the highest one, but it's kind of but in terms of income, it is also slightly larger than between the education. But I think that the education remains as well here. Finland is here. You can see there the pointer was actually. So the challenges to health policy debates were on the kind of changing diets and working obesity, health inequalities, and then public and private roles in the kind of provision of services. And because the public funding pressures from the private sector came from the occupational health care insurance. And we also kind of have this kind of issue about elderly care. And to some extent, we had issues with the public health services, kind of a basic health promotion and public health type of activities versus then health care services, which is kind of a primary care and hospital care. And we also have got the issues in terms of mental health and dementia, but in dementia, some of that can be accounted to improved reporting. So you can see kind of a raise in the more recent years, because people now actually kind of put mental health, the dementia mortality to account as dementia and not to some other reasons. So now we've got to the kind of a COVID part of that. So I think I ran this to kind of, I was concerned that that would be too slow. So I hope that I've kept my pace to kind of look at a bit comparison between the different Nordic countries and Finland. And we've done so far quite well. And I think that the most distinct difference between the COVID and the number of new cases is about between the Finland of is related to the, sorry. So the picture actually kind of shows you the daily confirmed new COVID cases. And the reason why I'm kind of perplexed was that I changed it in the last moment and I no longer have got the one with per million. But you can see that in the Swedish case, there is a lot of cases. In the case of the Sweden, of course, it's double the population of Finland and Denmark and Norway. So that needs to be remembered by using the daily confirmed new cases. But you can also kind of, even taking into account the population, that the Swedish cases are not double that to the rest of the Nordic countries, but substantially larger. So the politics and practice of COVID-19 in the current days is that in some sense low population density helps, but it's not the only answer. We've seen that actually in some of the kind of remote areas we've got COVID, and in between the Sweden and Finland, we can see clearly that Sweden is about the same population density as Finland. And we can see also that the idea that things are kind of not liking very much to meet other people could be kind of said that they don't differ so much with other Nordic countries that could explain the differences between the countries. So you may kind of need to look at two things, and I think that the two things I'd like to kind of look at is about organization of the measures inside the country, how to kind of operate, how to kind of tackle the epidemic. And then the second is about how much you've got mobility, international mobility, and what kind of a border measures you have. Because I think what you will see in Europe is that a number of countries which closed their borders totally in the big last spring, then after they opened the borders, then had a kind of a very high levels of COVID and very problematic situation inside the countries. So if you just have got the border measures, that's not going to be enough if you don't have got anything behind the borders. So in Finland, what I've been working with and involved with, and this means that I'm a bit biased to kind of see it as an explanation, one explanation, is that the health system has been able to recruit and move people from the other services to do testing and tracing, contact tracing, and control measures at the time of the epidemic. So it's been actually flexible to kind of look at the epidemic control measures. There's been lockdowns, and there's been twice. We are under a second time now in the spring, but they've not been as strict as in some other countries. We have mostly the concern has been about bars and restaurants and places where a lot of people kind of meet, which have been a concern. We've had some border measures which have been kind of challenged with the Nordic collaboration, because in the Nordic countries, people have used to be shopping across borders. they used to be kind of going without any border controls across Sweden and Finland, and between Norway and Finland. And they've been kind of very much of a concern in the border areas. And one of the issues which has kind of come out as well as a kind of a potential kind of a question is the mobility of people, and especially contract and informal labor challenges, because we don't have very much in Finland. We haven't had very much contract labor, but lately we've had some more in Europe, and we've had some exchanges with agricultural workers come in the spring, and then we've got a lot of contract workers in the construction sites. So you've got people moving from Estonia. So this spring and after Christmas, we saw the kind of numbers of the contract workers, construction workers coming kind of, there was an epidemic in the construction work, which then spread to the population. And that came in part because of the exchange between the Estonia and Finland, because the mobility, because the kind of mobility of the people was kind of quite high in that context. And you also saw it in especially in the kind of a border areas. You still can see a kind of a ring between Finland in terms of that most of the COVID cases are in the border areas. But also the crisis remains a challenge for power and use of politics. And we also have got some populist politics for the health policy. And while we have had higher rates of non-Finnish speakers, the rates have gone down quite quickly by community measures. And while we had some populist politics, they were more associated with the previous government initiatives when the National True Finns Party was part of the power and tried to kind of reduce immigrant access to social security. But generally, we've got the same kind of a bit of the same base for anti-foreigner, anti-gender, anti-vaccines, and anti-pandemic control measured politicking, which you can see in other European countries. We can see in the internet and spreading as part of the kind of assumptions and actions in relation to globalization. So you've got those all, but in quite limited forms. So as conclusions, the outcomes are quite good, and in that sense we are in good situation. But I think that there is a continuous challenge of middle class and the children growing up to getting accustomed to using the private sector, primary healthcare services, and not kind of necessarily thinking about the overall cross-subsidization of risks within the healthcare systems. And the healthcare reforms with the previous governments have sought commercialization for provision. And we have had private equity investors with provider change, which has kind of resulted in the fall of the previous government. So the current government is undertaking the healthcare reform in a bit different form. But I think that there is the continuous kind of a discussion with the big private sector actors and their interests and interest groups as part of that. And I think that the COVID, as other countries, we faced with the COVID-19 pandemic, the challenge of limits and lack of enough attention to public health. We had veterinarians sometimes in charge for the infectious diseases control in cities, and we had to kind of rearrange people to kind of take up new roles and new activities. So for the Finnish, just to kind of hint some sources. So I'll just kind of guide you to go to the European Observatory of Health Systems and Policies. It's a double-edged observatory, but it's got really, really good sources of every country and their health policies, health systems, and the, what you call HIT reports. And they also have an account of COVID measures where I've contributed on both of those streams. So that's why I know is a kind of account about what kind of legislation governments have imposed, what kind of measures they've imposed. So I really advise you to kind of look, and if you're interested in European health policies, just look on the European Observatory on Health Systems and Policies website. So, and last, just to say, thank you very much. And I'm open to questions. And the picture is not from Tampere, unfortunately, it's from Helsinki.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your wonderful presentation. Now we have a few questions for you in the chat box, and I shall now read them out to you. Sumbul Parveen has asked, could you throw some light on mental health deinstitutionalization as a challenge to the Finnish health system?
Mental health institutionalization was a big challenge because we used to have a lot of kind of mental health patients were in institutions. But as a result of the reform, my understanding, and of course, this is something I'm talking now off the cuff, I'm not kind of specializing in mental health. My understanding of the developments is that much of the kind of institutionalization has been now removed, and we face a bit different type of problem, that people don't get access to care or access to advice or access to therapies quickly enough. So you're kind of left much more on your own or within your communities, or expected to kind of cope in a situation with medicines where you might kind of actually benefit from care more. So I think that the institutionalization was a huge problem at a certain time because of the kind of extensiveness of it. But we may have gone to the other end now, and we might come a bit back.
Another question, this has been asked by several people, Shayanton, Akansha, and Snigdha. They have also asked how the state plans to address the problem associated with aging population and increasing health costs.
The healthcare reforms have been the kind of a part of the efforts to kind of address the costs, and especially the aging has been kind of at the part of that, and the previous government, which was kind of consisted of the kind of the True Finns, the Conservative Party, and the Central Party, which was more kind of on the political lining to the right, so to kind of gain that kind of effectiveness through the market forces, and through the kind of, they wanted to kind of introduce more market forces and more private sector to kind of sort that out. The only problem was that on the background of the evidence that we have, that's not the way to do that, that you don't reduce your healthcare costs by increasing choice in markets. And that the whole debate ended up into the fall of the government because of the kind of a means and the ends, and in some sense politics. But this was associated, their efforts were also associated with a huge kind of a cut on the healthcare costs to kind of improve the effectiveness. But I think that, I mean, what we need but I think in terms of the future, yes, the aging will be an issue. But I think that there is also a view which kind of emphasizes that aging is issue to a certain extent, that we also have got other factors that increase healthcare costs, and other factors that contribute to that. For example, the new technologies and IT in the healthcare system have the portion of those costs have kind of increased faster than aging. So the question is, at what time aging can also be seen that you've got a kind of a big, large age groups, large kind of a birth groups, or kind of what you would say that the people who've been, what you call a large, I don't know how to kind of translate the word, but anyway, so you've got the certain kind of generations that you had a very large age groups which are getting old. So they kind of a bulge on your pyramid. So after those, the kind of a large birth cohorts have gone, then you kind of then you're in a different situations. And I think that we need to be quite clear what we want to kind of have from aging societies. Do we want to have aging society where we invest in on elderly care services and where we invest more, or where we see cuts and kind of a very kind of a cost-efficient services? And I think Finland has tried to kind of move elderly care also to the home and to be more efficient. And I think that we now face the kind of the question about what kind of a society we want to be and how much we need to spend on doing elderly care properly as a requirement. And I think that discussion is still going on.
In this context, Akansha has also asked that, are there any measures or population policies to increase falling birth rates in Finland?
There have been some kind of even very explicit measures. In Finland, you've got in some municipalities, they try to kind of, localities, they've tried to kind of get people to move there through kind of giving straightforward funding for each child. Finland also has got a kind of supported measures to kind of in terms of maternity care, in terms of maternal leave, and you also pay for each children in terms of a compensation, government subsidy for children. So you've got a lot of those factors, but the question is where and how you kind of to motivate the kind of people actually to engage, and how to make working life such that people actually feel that they can have family and working life. And I think that might be something that goes beyond this kind of a social policy measures to the kind of a broader understanding of how to deal with it.
So due to the paucity of time, we were unfortunately unable to take up all the questions, but the last question we shall take up, what measures are taken to contain mental health issues in the ongoing pandemic time? What would you suggest for other countries like India?
I think the best mental health control measure is to kind of is the control of pandemic in the end of the day, because the better the control of the pandemic, the more you can actually put efforts in kind of people meeting each other and addressing the issue. At the moment, the vaccinations seem to be providing kind of a scope for that. But I think that loneliness and kind of in Finland, a lot of people complain about loneliness, but on the other hand, a lot of people have been kind of doing quite well. What we seem to have is that those who did not do very well mentally and did not do very well in society before the pandemic are doing even worse. And those who did quite well before that managed to do quite well during the pandemic. But I think that the basic thing is about that to kind of control the pandemic in the end.
Thank you Thank you so much for the discussion. Now over to Christabel Royan, Director of Nordic Center India.
On behalf of the Nordic Center in India, on behalf of Professor Bhaswati Sarkar and her entire team at the Center for European Studies, JNU, I would sincerely like to thank you, Professor. You have been fantastic. You've spent your time with us and we're very grateful for the same. We also would like to thank Tampere University for arranging this. Many thanks for showcasing the various facets of the public health system in Finland and for highlighting the various mechanisms through which it works in a welfare state. sincere thanks once again for spending your valuable time with us today. And I hope this has been an intellectually stimulating hour for you as it has been for all of us. Thank you very much.
Can I thank before Mikko will continue? Just
Yes.
thanks for everybody, and please kind of don't hesitate if there is a kind of a concern. I'm happy to kind of answer emails, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and hope to see you again at some point of time.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now over to Ravneet for the next lecture.
Good evening, everyone. So for the next session, we have Dr. Mikko Poutanen. He will be talking on Finnish welfare society and innovation system. He's a postdoctoral researcher in projects funded by the Koon Foundation and the Academy of Finland at Tampere University relating to higher education policy. He also specializes in political communication and political economy, currently in the context of higher education. He has also acted editor-in-chief of Politicasta since January 2009. And to welcome him officially, I would like Professor Bhaswati Sarkar to welcome Dr. Mikko Poutanen. Professor.
Professor Bhaswati's connection is lost, so we would ask Professor Mikko to start, and she will join later. Yeah.
Okay, then I will share my screen because I have slides. Actually, just a second when I locate them on my hard drive again. And here okay, just a second. I succeeded in this an hour ago. Now it's suddenly more difficult. Okay, here we go. Thank you for asking me to present. I'm very happy to be here, very happy to lecture to the students at JNU. I will probably start speeding up at some point, like I start to speak up really quickly. So just point that out if I start to go too quickly, and I'll slow down at least for a few minutes again. This is kind of like typical of me. So let's get to the topic. My title is From the Welfare State to Global Engineers to Nokiaization of Finland, relating to obviously Nokia, the former glory of the Finnish export industry, now in disrepair. But okay, so the Finnish historical context is necessary to understand the underlying movements of certain political powers that then move the innovation system. So post the Second World War, recovery Finland is quite often linked to the creation of the welfare state, especially from 1960s onwards. You have to understand that Finland was relatively late to industrialize and relatively late to urbanize, and between the 1950s and 1960s, it was predominantly an agrarian society. The welfare state was a reaction against the material threat of a communist takeover, which led to the Social Democrats working together with capitalists and political conservatives to build a capitalist welfare state with high levels of public services. So the welfare state is kind of born between the fear of socialism and the promise of free markets, so to speak. One of these innovation systems was a free and extensive public education system. You already heard about the public health system. The public education system then would include everything from elementary school to university. And it was one of the core policies driven by the political left. Was also accepted by the right as a prudent social investment. It was also very useful for the Finnish Social Democrats because it undermined the policy of Finnish communists, who also wanted to have this free public education. So when the Social Democrats could enable it without resorting to revolution, it was highly popular. And the communists slightly lost popularity as a result. So in essence, the Finnish welfare state should not be understood as a variety of it should be understood as a variety of capitalism. It was not a socialist system, even though certain political commentators might associate some sort of socialist systems with the Nordic states. The welfare state is more than just a total of policies, social policies, or an accumulation of social programs. It is a philosophical mindset and an underlying principle behind the way the services are delivered and financed. It is more of a closed circle of a system. It is a highly national system because it's the welfare state. So the state is in the focus, not international trade. The welfare state made sense in the context of having both capitalist and communist blocks of political economy until it ran into, number one, demands of liberal financial liberalization and the collapse of the bipolar international political economy, known as the end of history thesis, or actually it's more of a statement by Francis Fukuyama. This resulted in a very, very big recession in Finland because the Finnish industry had sought to liberalize. The financial system had also been more liberal in the 1980s. And in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Soviet trade went with it, and the Finnish banks also found themselves in a crisis of insolvency, there was a massive recession in the early 1990s in Finland. It is the most severe recession of its history. So thanks to high institutional durability, the welfare state was able to cushion the economic downturn for many Finns, and it also kept the welfare state institutionally operational. But there was also a distinct shift in governmental philosophy. Given that Keynesianism was largely discredited in the 1970s elsewhere, and after the recession also in Finland, and the communist political economy was discredited in the 1990s, in the early to mid 1990s, continuing to early 2000s, saw also a reformation of many Western social democratic parties seeking a new role in the globalized era as third way parties, looking to incorporate more market-oriented policies into their policy for the set of policies. And this meant obviously that when you start emphasizing more market-oriented policies, you start to perhaps slightly lose focus in some of the welfare state policies, which are state-centered, as the name implies. Social democratic parties look to capture more middle-class voters as deregulation, financial speculation, and global trade increased Western wealth. And the original compromise of the welfare state can be reconceptualized as this. So as the sort of red ball of socialism has vanished largely from the setup, it is a more of a compromise between free markets and welfare state, meaning that it leans more towards free markets, even though many Finnish institutions of the welfare state still endure. They have been imbued with new market-oriented logics. So the recession of the 1990s at the cusp of globalization and capital liberalization was immediately associated with a perception of high taxation levels of the welfare state being harmful to the dynamics of businesses and economic growth. We will see later that this is not exactly accurate. But the perceived wasteful handling of resources in the public sphere, most pronounced in these times of economic duress, the recession of 1990s, makes privatization or commercialization of public services appear as the only viable, responsible, sustainable, or even just legitimate option given. The public sector is reconceptualized as a burden on the national economy rather than a source of value creation. So the state's role has noticeably diminished in Finnish public policy discourse in the 2000s, which also influenced how public education has been perceived. It is necessary, yes, but it's also seen as rather inefficient, and more efficiency requirements have been directed at Finnish education, both at the lower levels and on the higher levels. So now we get to Nokia. So Nokia was a large business to begin with, but it was not very international. It was more of an industrial company that then rose into its fame by a combination of extremely fortuitous market circumstances, the liberalization of the telecoms industry in Finland and across Europe in general, and the access to relatively cheap, highly educated workforce. I mean, Finnish workers were not as expensive comparatively back in the 1990s as they perhaps are perceived today. And the availability of cutting-edge technology, also the sort of in the electronics business that was starting to really boom in the 1990s. In the context of the 1990s recession, Nokia became symbolically important as the single company that became the locomotive that pulled Finland not only out of the recession, but also onto the world stage, economically speaking. Nokia became the emblematic Finnish company that spearheaded a small Nordic nation out of recession and into global markets. And it also became, unsurprisingly, a very desired employer for many people in higher education. And Nokia was also hiring a lot of people from Finnish universities, even going as far as to requiring that the Finnish universities increase technological education to meet its growing demands. So the promise of globalization was really made manifest in Finland in a tangible way. The export-focused political economy took a distinct pro-market stance in business and state activities. And this is the Nokiaization of the Finnish political economy. Success of companies like Nokia convinced Finns that export-oriented industries should be prioritized in policy over other considerations. Concerns over the competitiveness of Finnish labor became a major issue also in education. So you need to have sufficient numbers of highly educated workers to meet the growing demand. So it became standard reasoning in Finland that what was good for Nokia was also good for the nation, and public policy should be changed to reflect this new common sense. Higher education was geared up, particularly in technology and the mathematical and natural sciences, to satiate Nokia's need for increased workforce. Access to global capital also made Nokia quickly too big for Finland. Nokia was no longer particularly Finnish in terms of its actual ownership in the 2000s. So it's perhaps associated with Finland, but already in the early 2000s, the company was no longer really Finnish. In 1999, Nokia already accounted for 4% of the Finnish GDP and 23% of total Finnish exports. Nokia also accounted for 60% of the total capitalization of the Helsinki Stock Exchange around that time. And in 2007, now the firm's Finnish employees topped to almost 25,000 people. So you can understand that this was indeed a very exceptional company in all the significant ways a company can be. A single company of such stature would be also a key factor in forming the social reality of many Finns when it came to the national and public political economy, meaning that having experience and having seen what Nokia is and what Nokia can accomplish, this became sort of the new way of orienting towards the economy and the state in a more larger scale. However, Nokia's rise also included a very uneven distribution of benefits. The global manufacturing chains already rose in the early 2000s, and it enabled Nokia to proceed with a cost minimization plan. Nokia's promise of globalization became unevenly met when manufacturing could be, and from the perspective of economic production, had to be outsourced to enhancing competitiveness. In other words, Finnish manufacturing suppliers lost out very early and were less involved in the benefits reaped by the Finnish locomotive of globalization, meaning that what could be perhaps classified as low-skilled labor was no longer feasible to have those manufacturing sites in Finland, but to move them elsewhere to locations where there was more abundant and cheaper labor, perhaps also with slightly lighter labor regulation available. So, but at the time, because Nokia was still skyrocketing, the suffering of Finnish subcontractors was often seen as a simple, not natural outcome of globalization, where Nokia's continued success justified the unfortunate side effects, and Nokia's R&D was still mostly in Finland, also in other Western countries. But it's as the 2000s progressed, more and more of that also moved into other countries. So as long as the global economy was doing very well and the Finnish state was buoyed up by the increased inflow of export gains, there was nothing to worry about. Nokia was the national champion in international business, and the Finnish press treated it often as such. With news reporting equated with the gospel of the free markets. Nokia's fall from glory, all great stories of rise and fall have to come to the point of fall at some stage. By the financial crisis of 2008, Nokia suddenly turned entirely into a broken promise of globalization made manifest. In Finland, thousands were laid off, even the white-collar R&D workers. As the vanguard of the Finnish globalization and national prestige foundered, while at the same time Finns were asked to participate in the debt relief packages to the Eurozone. So this raised a lot of political dissatisfaction in Finland. Obviously, as Nokia starts to fall, it no longer takes up as many labor started to become tighter. So studies have shown that Nokians, especially those in high-level R&D jobs, took the downsizing quite well. They had buffers, they perhaps had accumulated savings, and in other ways could survive the downsizing quite well. Whereas employees in manufacturing with lower levels of education and least transferable skills felt betrayed, because quite often the Nokia plant in a city was one of the best places where one could work. And if that plant shut down, there was no other opportunities. So Finnish society sees the narrative of Nokia as a moral parable of wastefulness. Nokia's failure to be competitive in the global market reflects back on Finland. We have wasted our opportunity, we have wasted our wealth, and now it's time to get serious and start cutting austerity politics, in other words. A moral argument was constructed wherein the good economic years have made both Nokia and Finland fat and reduce its performance. So what is needed is trimming the fat, reducing the fat. It's a very interesting rhetorical device, because usually people associate that if you cut the fat, that's harmless, that it's something that's excess, it is something that's unnecessary, even unhealthy, if you take a more medical-based metaphor. But in fact, quite often in this rhetoric, there was endless fat, that there was no degree of cutting that would satisfy certain commentators who always saw more fat to cut. As a consequence, the Finnish university system was also reformed in 2010 to emphasize commercial applications, strategic management, and innovation results. This is not something that was absent completely in Finnish education before, but this was something that was emphatically brought to the forefront. The Finnish consensus culture and close relations of the Finnish political and economic elites, also educational elites, which was a remnant from the old welfare statist era, promoted an economist rationality which offered technocratic management of the polity. This system of management was transferred to the university system despite resistance. The apparent decrease in ideological clashes rather suggests, in my view, that there was an ideological convergence towards one ideological preference, which narrows down the range of acceptable and plausible and responsible policy alternatives. Global trade undermines the relatively closed circuit of the economic and social policy relating to high labor standards and imposes a heavier burden of social policy costs than it was designed to bear. Meaning that when Nokia started to lay off workers, the Finnish welfare state was starting to creak at the seams, because those people who previously were funding the welfare state, meaning the workers at Nokia, were now becoming costs to the welfare state because their unemployment or other social benefits would have to be paid. Institutional actors in Finland and elsewhere have been calling this separation of economic policy from politics depoliticization, where economic facts and value politics would be separated from the point that economic facts do not fall under politics. This is a direct quote from the then president of the Bank of Finland, who actually said in an interview that economic facts do not fall under politics. This was coincided with an attack on university democracy, because the old universities had a very thick layer of university democracy that determined how they would act. And this was seen as a detrimental thing, something that would slow down the necessary reforms following this economist logic mentioned before. So Finnish society has been marked by technocratic consensus well before the financial crisis. The crisis and austerity politics merely reinforced this consensus afterwards. Within this consensus, parties may still compete with one another for votes, sometimes even intensively so, but they came to find themselves sharing the same broad commitments in government and confining themselves to the same ever-narrowing repertoire of policymaking. This is from Peter Mayer's book, Ruling the Void. He is not talking about Finland specifically, but many Western social democratic parties in more general terms. And also, Jungnar argues that the ideological convergence between left and right facilitates the success of the populist radical right. And indeed, this is something we've seen also in Finland. I heard Professor Koivusalo already mentioning the Finns party. Well, the Finns party would argue in favor of the welfare state, as it discursively positioned itself on the side of the people and the ordinary man, as populist movements tend to do. But at the same time, it accepted the basic to interview them today. Their economic policy is fairly, you could describe it as right-wing, meaning that it earlier comment that it is not necessarily that you should not look at the welfare state as a set of policies or social programs, but more as a mindset. I don't think the having a sort of diverse society as such is a problem. It's just that you kind of require having the majority of that society agreeing that this is the correct type of policy that they want to see implemented. Unfortunately, I do not know enough of the political economy and the intricacies of Indian politics to venture a more certain estimate.
Okay, so we have another question here from Sumbul. She's asked, how is Finland dealing with fluctuating employment statuses, which possesses a great challenge to the national efforts of generating better innovation?
The Finnish unemployment system still at this moment is relatively, you could call it generous, that if you are employed, you get a higher per diem after you become unemployed if you have signed up to a trade union. That if you are a union member, then you also, while you pay your union dues, you're also paying for the unemployment fund, which then if I recall correctly, it's 360 days. So it's a year's worth of money at most. After that, you fall to more basic social subsidies. So this has been seen as something that helps innovation, that if someone falls or ends up unemployed, they are not in an immediate crisis situation, but rather have the opportunity to use the unemployment benefit to look for work that is a better, like well suited for them, right? It's a better match for them. It's also more useful under those circumstances for the employer. However, there is a lot of talk in Finland that this current system is too generous and it should be cut back to make people accept work, whatever that work may be. But from the perspective of innovations, it's actually quite hard to see how that would work, because workers who are a good match with their job are more likely to innovate than people who are working in a particular job simply to make ends meet.
Okay. There is another question which says, what is the impact of neoliberalism on labor relations? What kind of pressure is the Finnish state facing from neoliberals for withdrawing from society and economy?
So I'll take at least the trade question first. That's a very interesting question, because in the Finnish context, you have to understand that the Finnish state is not an official, like it is a part of the labor negotiations, but it rather lets the employee and employer organizations to discuss between themselves what can be afforded and what can't be afforded. And then the state will then support these decisions, for example, with tax breaks or something else that has been decided. Currently, we're in a situation where the largest employer unions have either left or are seriously considering leaving these negotiations. Like we've had these tripartite negotiations between the employers, the employees, and the state. And now in the last few years, it really appears like those sort of negotiations might be a thing of the past, that they're going to go away simply because the employers no longer see the benefit of that. They would rather want to have local agreements, which for them obviously are more beneficial because they can have more leverage locally than if you deal with national unions. What was the second part of the question?
The second part of the question was, what kind of pressure is the Finnish state facing from neoliberals from withdrawing from the society and economy?
The usual, I would say, basically that the state should not do anything really other than facilitate markets. We have, in addition, the Finns party is sort of like 50-50 in that regards. Then we have a political party that is 100% in that direction, and the rest it varies, I would say. So, like I said, it's that the sort of neoliberal common sense has really deeply impacted Finnish politics, at least on the level of discourse. I wouldn't overstress it though, because we still have the many institutions of the welfare state remain, but the operating logics of those welfare states, those welfare institutions have changed. The universities are a very good example of that, because the innovation previously was thought of something that comes spontaneously and naturally out of research. And now we have this sort of more stressed funding system that is looking for those innovations primarily, that if you make a funding application, then you have to have some sort of impactful things that you can already predict at that stage that your research is going to create. So, and as I mentioned, that the STEM, meaning the natural sciences, mathematics, and technology, are highly stressed in delivering these innovations. So this wouldn't be neoliberal in itself necessarily, but simply reimagining the purpose of education as something that produces innovations is really different in Finland, I'd say.
Okay, so we have this another question which says, how has Finland coped with Nokia's collapse and re-engaged the skills and non-skilled human resources?
Well, I think many of the people that were laid off by Nokia have found work if they had transferable skills, if they had relatively high education, they have found other, like Nokia, when Nokia started to lose or lay off, let's be more specific, many thousands of workers, Nokia actually did something that is perhaps a remnant from the welfare state. They had a social program called the Nokia Bridge, in which they paid for entrepreneurial training. They also paid for a seed money, that if you wanted to start a company with something that you worked on at Nokia, and Nokia would no longer be working on that, then they would give you a seed money for that, like 20,000 euros or something. There were a lot of sort of policies that Nokia decided to implement as corporate social responsibility programs that reflected its long relationship with Finland. I haven't seen anything similar in the Finnish economy since, and I doubt I will, because it was really exceptional.
So we have this another question which says that Finland has an old age dependency ratio which is above 50. So do you believe the innovation can play a role powerful enough to bring demographic balance back in those states?
That is an excellent question. If I could answer that in the positive, I would be seeking a position in the Finnish cabinet. They would be probably very happy to have me. That is a difficult question, because at the moment it looks like no, like we don't have any innovations that would somehow change the demographic structure of a Nordic nation. Like it simply does not exist. We can do various things to mitigate the challenges of this, but it would probably require dismantling even more of the welfare state, unless we go in an entirely different direction, like universal basic income or something similar, which it's been discussed. We've had a pilot of it, but it wasn't, I mean, the universal basic income pilot was very interesting in the sense that it delivered happier citizens, but no economic benefit. So it was considered a loss, a failure, because it only made people happy.
And we have this last question for you. It says, how do you observe Finland's fiscal policy towards EU?
Finland is among the sort of frugal north, so to speak, that Finns consider their fiscal policy towards the EU is very sort of, you could even say egoistic. What are we getting out of this? And are we paying more than someone else? Are we getting less than someone else? So it's not a very constructive approach, in my opinion, towards something that definitely requires collaboration and cooperation for collective success. I mean, the Eurozone works as an economic bloc only if it is an economic bloc that pulls together. If it starts to pull in different directions, it's going to have a lot of problems. But when it comes to innovation, I might mention this, that the Bologna process of higher education markets, this is something that probably is quite well known. So that's something EU policy, that it's a common innovation policy, common higher education policy that they are trying to promote. And that is something, it's not fiscal, but it is an EU policy that Finland has strongly subscribed to.
Thank you so much for your session. Now I would like to request Professor Bhaswati Sarkar to come in and give you a welcome thank you note. She was logged out of the session before. Ma'am.
Thank you, Ravneet. Sorry, I just somehow lost connection and got logged out. So I didn't have the opportunity to formally welcome you, Dr. Poutanen, to the Nordic Summer School. And we really appreciate that you are here with us today. And that was an excellent presentation. It was actually packed with information, and especially the Nokia story. And I hope you enjoyed being with us, and the number of questions which you got in terms which shows the interest that it generated. Thank you once again for being with us.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure. This topic is something that could have taken a 90-minute lecture, and I still wouldn't have exhausted it, and probably even more questions would have arisen.
Absolutely. So we will have you over some other time.
I will be very happy
for an extensive lecture.
To participate again. And if someone is working on the political economy of the Nordics or are interested in the so-called Nokia story, I had my email address at the end of the slides, and I can then also share it through the organizers if necessary. That if you want to contact me, feel free.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And now I would request Ms. Christabel Royan, from Nordic Center India, to thank you, Dr. Mikko.
Many thanks, Mikko. Just to reiterate again or reaffirm what Professor Sarkar has said, many thanks to you. It was a complex theme that you presented to us, very informative, very honest discussion, and I'm very grateful for the same. I hope you've had a wonderful time with us, an intellectually stimulating time. I know that the participants on this side have been enjoying the lecture, and I hope you've enjoyed your time with us as well. Thank you again very much, and thank you to Tampere University as well.
Thank you.
And now I would like my colleague Debanjali to come in and take us to the session 3. Thank you, Dr. Mikko, for your session.
Thank you, Ravneet. I would request Professor Haldor to switch on his video so we can spotlight him. Welcome to the last speaker for the day, Professor Haldor Byrkjeflot. I hope I got that right, who will be speaking on the civil society in the Nordics. He is a professor at the Department of Sociology and Human Geography at the University of Oslo in Norway. He has also been the managing director of a large-scale strategic priority area related to research on the Nordic model at the University of Oslo. His research interests include the emergence and circulations of societal and organizational models, organizational theory, bureaucracy, as well as historical comparative studies. Now over to Professor Bhaswati Sarkar for the welcome remarks.
Fine. Thank you, Debanjali. Welcome to our summer school, Professor Haldor. I'm not even trying to pronounce the latter part of your name. So if you could just pronounce it for us, that would be wonderful.
Haldor Byrkjeflot. Yeah, Byrkjeflot.
Byrkjeflot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you, thank you. So, it's so good to have you here. I reached out to Suneva, Professor Suneva, and I was telling her if there is somebody who could talk to us about civil society in the Nordics, because there are students at the center who are working on it, and it would be of great interest to us. Yesterday we had one session in which there was that session was on active citizenship in the Nordics. So I think it sort of flows into very nicely to today's lecture on civil society, because all of this are connected. And when we look at the welfare model, how do we look at the welfare? What is the kind of connection between the success of the welfare model with the activism and the alertness of the civil society? How does it play its role? What kind of role? And from here, when we looked at the 2015 crisis, for instance, the refugee crisis, we also saw how the civil society was very active in, sort of helping out and reaching out, and both in terms of helping out with what the challenge that the states faced vis-a-vis the refugee inflow, and also reaching out to the refugees in trying to getting them settled, etc. So over to you, Professor Haldor, and welcome once again.
Thank you. I will share my screen. So, I guess you have heard a lot about these countries, so I don't have to introduce, but here you have the map once more of the Nordic countries. I will say a bit about why I am doing research on this issue at the moment. I have some of the books I have been editing earlier are showed here, but what we are now finishing an edited volume on the making and circulation of Nordic models, so that I'm almost done with that topic for a while. So the next I'm working on is Nordic governance, and the title is Bringing the Associations Back In. So this is sort of my research area at the moment, the circulation of Nordic models, and what role does the associations play in the development of the Nordic models. So I will say a bit about the Nordic models. So what is a Nordic model? We will say that a model is Nordic if it is that no overlap between the Nordic countries, and also possible to establish a clear distinction related to other modern societies. So this is a strict criteria. So very often that it's not that strict for what we're calling something a Nordic model, and I will tell you why later. But let's look at some of the elements that are now commonly thought of as Nordic model. For the first, what is the tripartite negotiations, which is also sometimes called neo-corporatism. The Nordic countries still have this, although I heard from my Finnish colleague that it might be on its way out there, but that has been predicted before. Then we have generous and sometimes called universal welfare state. And the last one here, active gender equality policy and politics. But this is what I'm going to talk about today. Sometimes civil society is brought in as a definition, but quite often it is not actually. So the Nordic model is a scholarly and a political concept. As a scholarly concept, it's certainly historians have been talking about it, but it really took off when Gösta Esping Andersson's book from 1990, Three Phases of Welfare, where the the Nordic model is one of 3 models. Political, as a political model, it has been around for a long time. There is a best-selling book in the US, 1936, Sweden, The Middle Way, and it has been involved in various international discourses, the Third Way, and all these presidents have sort of tried to import, or they have been criticizing the Nordic model. And here in 2011, World Economic Forum brought up the Nordic model, and The Economist was talking about the Nordic model as a super model. So since then, it has been a lot of things going on about this concept. So this is one way. This is one way of talking about the Nordic model. It's one model, a big model, a societal model, but it's much more used in other ways, like a concept for a particular policy transfer, like education model, model for prison reform, family policy, prostitution regulation. This is where we find the Nordic model used most in, if you search newspapers and so media basis. And as you see then, it has a long history and it's contested. It has several layers of meaning. So nonetheless, I think that the most common model way of talking about, or perhaps the most important, and this is very much the social democrats, like they have a Nordic association, and they have had they are pushing very much this way of thinking about Nordic model, but it is in general quite this. It's not much disagreement about this. It's in the Nordic countries. Most parties subscribe to some sort of this kind of thinking around the Nordic model. So it's 3 spheres. It's the organized work sphere, with the tripartite cooperation, and then it's public welfare, strong welfare organization, and then it's the economic governance. So where there is some disagreement is where is the origin of this model. And Espen Andersen, he launched this perspective that it's all about research mobilization. So the reason why this model exists is that there is a balance of power between labor and employers, and the state is sort of negotiating between them. But without unions, there wouldn't be anything like this model in this perspective. Then we have another way of thinking about the Nordic model, which is more historical, and I will refer to a book from 1997 that has been quite important, which is called The Nordic Model as the Cultural Construction of Norden. This tells a much longer story of what the Nordic model is. It starts out with, well, it could start out with the Vikings, but Reformation is another starting point. We had a Lutheran Reformation in the Nordic countries. And what is very specific about the Nordic countries is this Lutheran background. And what matters for civil society in particular is what we call the Second Reformation, the revivalist movements who wanted to make to get away from the official church. A lot of different kind of movements around this topic. But it is very important, this idea of the Reformation. It has become much more important argument that, like we talk about civil religion, that this is penetrating the Nordic systems. And we are different from the Calvinists that Weber talks about. The Lutherans, the Reformed, the original Lutherans that that the Nordics are much more individualistic, because they have to negotiate with God personally, and they have to read the Bible. You have to learn how to write and read because of this. So that's why we have very early development of schooling and almost 100% of the population could read by 1800. And the priests were, of course, very important in these societies. So we talk about the Enlightenment, the pastoral Enlightenment, and the potato priests. We also talk about another issue that is important in this cultural construction perspective is the free farmer. The Nordic countries hasn't been under feudalism and serfer and being under the large godseier, as we call them, the large big farm owners. So it's the free smallhold farmer who is, and this is a myth, but of course there is some reality to it also. More recent perspective also, if you look at how the welfare state was built, then it is very much through the idealistic professions, and pastoral professionalism plays a role in this picture also. A lot of the professions are usually not brought in when you talk about civil society, but in this perspective, they might be brought in. And then the least but not last, this is actually one of the most important perspective that is pushed from this culturalist perspective at the moment. That is the idea of statist individualism. So the argument goes this way. We have a big welfare state. This makes us free from the family. We have childcare. We have all kinds of support. So you don't really need to rely on the family. So you are an individual supported by the state. So this is the Swedish model. In the US, they have the individual and family, and Germany would be the family and the state. So this is an important argument at the moment. And it relies on this value map that the Nordic countries are the most secular national values and the most self-expression values. So you see India is in the middle here and Sweden is way up there. So when Trägård talks about this statist individualism, he also explains it from culture, from this map. So let me get to the civil society then. My aim here is to argue that there is a third way of talking about the Nordic model, and that is from a view of civil society. But what is civil society? I have to start out with the Anglo-American model because this is penetrating all research on civil society. And that's where the concept comes from now. So in this version of civil society, which is the most common, civil society is prior to and distinct from the state, a deinstitutionalized state. In this benign form even, the state is always on the brink of being a source of tyranny. Even though it is all kinds of checks and balances, it's always something wrong when it comes from the state in this perspective, because that's why you need civil society in order to keep control of the state. So civil society is private. State is public. This way of thinking also pervades the Habermas and Cohen and Arato tradition. If you know a bit about Habermas, it's all about life world, the natural world, which is family and association, public sphere, and the system world, which is both the state and the market. This is more the German tradition, which is also much more critical of the state historically, and also Putnam Coleman. So why do we have this concept of civil state. We haven't had this historically. It has, of course, we can talk about Aristotle and go back to the early philosophers or the early like Adam Smith and so on, but really it's early post-war this emerged as an important concept. In the 1970s, it was the cultural politics, the new social movements who pushed this concept, but it has even taken more off after 1989 because of post-communism and the transformation of these societies. So I will argue then that Nordic civil societies do not fit this theory, and I'm not the only one who has argued this. Associations have provided infrastructure for development of state as well as local governance in the Nordic countries since early mid-1800s. It has not been referred to as civil society, but you have used terms like people's movements, organization, democracy, associations. Oh, you could come up with a lot of different associations with different names. So there is a congruence of structure among governmental and non-governmental organizations. Because some of these are public, some of these are private, it has been mixed because in the early development. I refer to an American political scientist who observed Norwegian organizations are typically hierarchical and constitutionally detailed democracies. He observed this in the 60s. Samfunn means, which can be translated as society, means both society and state. We don't have a strict distinction between welfare state and welfare society. So what happened when associational Norden was rediscovered? Because we have had this drive towards understanding ourselves as civil societies. Particularly the Americans coming here has had something to tell us about this. I have been studying the American consultant, which was very important for developing Norwegian management post-war. He came to Norway in the 1950s as helped by the Marshall help, the American support for development of Norwegian industry. And he said, you guys do not understand what an organization is. When you guys talk about organization, you talk about associations, but that's not what an organization is. An organization is a firm. I have referred to Eckstein also. He came to Norway in 1967 to understand why Norway could have become so democratic. And he observed the extreme organizability of the country. This refers to the existence of an unrivaled network of voluntary associations that on the whole have great density of membership, are highly centralized and cohesive, and play a most important role in all aspects of social life. And I have mentioned these early journalists who wrote about the Nordic countries who sort of observed this. I now move on to what the researchers on civil society in the Nordics say about this. The characteristics of Nordic civil society, they say, is high level of participation, democratic, inclusive, and broadly membership-based structure. So this at least was the case. And we are still, the Nordic countries are still among who have the highest participation in voluntary organizations. They are hierarchically organized with national, regional, and local chapters. Here I will show this, an example of an organization that we are talking about. This is the Norwegian Women's Public Health Association, which has been very active during now the corona pandemic. Founded in 1896 as preparation for a possible war with Sweden. As you know, we haven't had any war, but we were part of Sweden, and in 1905 we were free of Sweden without a war. So they were preparing for that. They have had a much larger number of members, but they still have 41,650 local chapters. And in Norway, as in Finland, we have municipalities, like 300 municipalities. So they have more than one in each municipality. And they are still nationwide and democratically structured. They run according to democratic principles. They have a national board. And they have been very active during corona pandemic. As you see, they are making protective material that we really lacked in the early period of the pandemic. So here is an example of this kind of organization that was supposedly the Norwegian or Nordic kind. I should say that perhaps Norway is had stronger democratic link between, particularly if you look at this one, organized with national, regional, and local chapters. They were seen as part of the countercultures. And Steinrockan has observed how these were really nation-building organizations. Then they observed this state-friendly relationship. So we can talk about three phases of associational governance. The first, nation building. This was the first generation of national movements based on moral values. I already talking about how important Lutheranism was and church organizations. The second phase is the state integration phase. And what is important, and like this Norwegian, the Women's Association of Public Health, they were inventors of new fields. They were building the public health system. It was this organization who eliminated tuberculosis in Norway, and they built a lot of hospitals for taking care of tuberculosis and so on. But also they have been mediators between interests, and they have been participated in public committees. So here we can perhaps talk about we had a power analysis in Norway which talked about the problem with this, that it leaves us with a very segmented state. And there is not that many welfare organizations anymore. We now have leisure and culture and sports is the big increase in this field. So movements until now have been nation building. They have been on the offensive. They have integrated the society and so on. But clearly, the new kind of movements we are much more reactions to globalizations and are more defensive and risk-centered. But let me just come up with some more examples of Nordic movements. We have religious movements, and I here want to show you two people, Grundtvig and Hans Nielsen Hauge. Grundtvig is very influential in Denmark in building the high schools. You see how serious he is. He's a pietist. In Norway, we had the Hans Nielsen Hauge movement. You see how happy they are. They are evangelists. Very important for building Norwegian industry, actually. First industry builders. And Hans Nilsen Hauge was put to jail 14 times and he had to give up, but the movement continued. 200,000 printed documents in 1805 in a population with, well, I'm not sure, 2 million, 2 or 3 million. Next movement, labor movement. Well, this is behind what we were talking about, the Gösta Esping Andersen and the tripartite system, neo-corporativism. And then we have the women's movement, which is, of course, very important in the Nordic countries. I assume you had someone talk about state feminism. I'll show you the first state feminist. We had the first female prime minister in Norway in 1981, Gro Harlem Brundtland, but we also had Helga Arnes, who joined her as state secretary, and she was behind the first state feminist documents. So we have had a pro-women state, which has been important. And here, this is about how what kind of movements were behind this situation. So we talk, which is important, similar to when we talk about statist individualism. You can talk about defamiliation, which is done to get women into the labor market. Okay, so now we move towards what happens to this civil society or this associational governance in the Nordic countries. New issues, new motivations, more identity-based associations. Clearly, they are not necessarily democratic anymore. Some of them work more like special interest associations, consultants. They use the new social media. So clearly there is a big change. We also have different, we have privatization in the health, in the welfare sector. The Nordic countries have very small voluntary share in the welfare sector and the health sector and the schools. So Denmark has a tradition of private schools, but that's a very different one from the Swedish development, where they now have 15% private profit schools. And Sweden is a special case. I am sorry here, I can't say much about Finland. I should have brought Finland into this. But Sweden is moving towards a much more private profit welfare sector and school sector. The same is not happening in the other countries. So that's a mixed situation. So I will now come up with two views of this Nordic, because in Norway, and I think it's rather representative of the other countries also, we have different views on what is happening to the Nordic civil society. Here is the pessimistic view. Here you see Per Selle, who is a bit pessimistic here. He first point out Sweden, the development of Sweden, but also the use of market models in public sector has implications for the voluntary sector. As mentioned, actually, what was going on was that public sector mirrored the voluntary sector and so on. It's very difficult to say that it's the state and then it's the voluntary organizations, because they have been so intermixed. But when public sector gets privatized or market models they have to create these clearer distinctions. So this has impact on the public, on the voluntary sector, and also, of course, the influx of the what we call the Anglo-Saxon model of civil society, which creates a new understanding of what civil organizations is about. So here we have the optimistic version. This is my colleague Fredrik Engelstad, and actually both him and Per Selle was in the Norwegian Power Commission, who were researching what happens to power in the North. That was a very pessimistic view in early 90s, but I think he has an argument for that. Well, we have a pro-civil state. Think about Helga Hernes. She was important in order to create a pro-women state. And maybe there is, the state has really developed politics for civil society with the problems I have talked to you about. But on the other hand, we also put a lot of money into subsidies to media and literature in order to preserve diversity and competition. And the new technologies can be used in many ways. So then I have presented the positive and the negative view. I will not conclude here but as you understand, I'm on my way to make an argument, something like this. You really need to understand the relationship between associations and these tripartite negotiations was going on. Perhaps they couldn't work without continuous mobilizations among unions. The same with the welfare state. I think it's not that easy that it's either state or associations or either. And also what matters is how these professions work. So maybe this is a way to think. But as you understand, I'm on my way to find out how to make this argument about bringing associations back into the Nordic model. I'm quite sure that it has been forgotten too much lately, that the role of these associations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for such an interesting presentation. We have several questions for you in the chat box, which we shall now take up. So the first question is from Surbhi Singh. What are the reasons for existence of strong civil society in Norway and Finland as compared to Sweden? And related to this is another question. Are there any peculiarities of civil society role in Nordic model? Also, could you please throw some light on the transnational civic cooperation at the regional level?
Okay. Yes. The first question, why is there a difference between Norway and Finland and Sweden and Denmark? Well, I'm not sure there is that much of a difference. Actually, it depends on what you're talking about. All these four countries among the highest in the world in voluntary participation. What is different is that Sweden has much less welfare associations. So that is something to be explained. One of the reasons why the privatization is going so fast in Sweden is that they don't have voluntary. They're only 2 or 3%, but whereas in Norway we have 8% at least, and we have hospitals and so on. But they have a bit of a different tradition in Sweden. It seems to me that what is called people's movements have been more political. They have been actually even closer to the parliament. And another thing with Sweden is that they have a somewhat different kind of state church. The church has not been as mobilizing. They have been more a high church. And I also mentioned another thing that could be, if you think there is a difference, then I would use Stenius' theory. He says that Norway, Finland are new nations. We don't mobilize against a very strong established system. So actually, the mobilization has penetrated the state to a stronger extent. So maybe the Finnish and Norwegian states are more friendly to this. Okay, then we should also talk about Denmark, but I guess I have to respond to the other question also. Can you repeat that? I can't hear you.
Are there any peculiarities of civil society in the Nordic model? And could you please shed some light on transnational civic cooperation at the regional level?
Yes, regional level, that's an important question. The Nordic countries, due to language, I think particularly, we all understand each other. And the Swedish, the Finns also have some Swedish speaking, and it used to be more of them. The professions did have Nordic associations. The social policy, the ministries did have it, lawyers, and this has been going on since late 1800s. And the Social Democrats have always been working on a Nordic level. So indeed, there is both on the political and the associational level, there is cooperation. And even more probably before EU, and also English, the Englishification of us all. That's so that's of course important in order to understand why we became similar. But of course, and also a lot of these movements, labor movement, revivalist movements, women, they are international. So of course you can think of them from that perspective, even though they mobilized in a very national way.
The second question is from Shayantan Ghoshal. To what extent do civil society organizations play a role in helping immigrant refugee women get employed in the Nordic labor market?
That's, yeah, I know during this immigration crisis in 2015, there were a lot of mobilization in civil society in different countries. So they at least welcomed the immigrants and so on, and built some help in the. When it comes to employment, what I know is that there is the immigrant groups are mobilizing, and like when you see now during this pandemic, also you can see that going on in the different immigrant communities, like in Oslo and so on. But I wouldn't say that there is any systematic effort. I believe the state is funding some initiatives like that, but yeah.
The third question is, what is your take on a global world where neoliberalism is taking over civil societies?
Yeah, well, I think I was talking about it, that when the state is becoming privatized in the sense that it takes over private models, not necessarily privatization, it has a tendency to make sharp distinctions between voluntary organizations and so on. And also we have this outsourcing going on, and it's hard for the voluntary societies to compete with private when they have to participate in competitions, tenders, and so on. So that's certainly related to that. But of course, you can also look at neoliberalism as a movement. So there are of course some mobilizations going on there also. So
Dr. Hemant has asked, how do you justify considering civil society as countercultural in nature, as pointed out by you?
Now, in the Norwegian tradition, Stein Rokkan has sort of argued that these movements are countercultures, and they create political parties, and then they get integrated in the Norwegian system. I don't think necessarily that from that perspective you have to say that it continues as countercultures. I think whether it's a counterculture or not will depend on what time and also what kind of movement. So I think this counterculture, after all, often becomes hegemonic cultures. So I wouldn't say that necessarily that they are always countercultures. But this, if you don't have that aspect, you will not understand where the renewal comes from. So yeah, there is an opposition element in civil society.
The next question asks that, do you see any recent change among the Nordic society regarding the violence and discrimination against members of the LGBTI community?
Yeah, I think there is a strong focus on this issue. So I don't know very much about how it is in detail, how it is treated in detail, but at least I observe that there is a strong focus on these issues in the current situation, in the news media and in the politics of parties.
So a related question is also, what is the role played by civil societies in Nordic towards the cause of differently abled people?
Towards the
cause of differently abled people.
Okay, the disabled and so on. Okay, yeah, that's part of the welfare state to take care of disabled, and it is. I know that they do fund the personal assistance, and this is a very costly thing to do. So this is clearly has been important for the welfare state.
Given Lutheranism is intrinsic to the Nordic welfare system, how difficult does it make to integrate people from other religions?
Of course, that is an issue. I think what has been the case. This argument that Lutheranism is penetrating our cultures has not been very popular. We have been thinking ourselves as secular, and I guess this has been. I'm not sure that has been good for the integration. I think it's better that these values are pronounced, so it's possible to work on them to understand each other, or I would say rather understand ourselves. That's important.
Sumbul Parveen has asked, how have exogenous forces such as individualization impacted volunteering and participation in civil society in the Nordics?
How has, could you repeat?
How have exogenous forces such as individualization impacted volunteering and participation in civil society in the Nordics?
Okay, that's a good question. I think clearly it is breaking up the large associations. If everyone has to be a special identity and be him or herself, that creates a different kind of organizations, smaller and more specialized. So that's it. But I don't think. I think things that are told to be individualist is not necessarily individualism. That's why I'm critical of this statist individualist thesis. I don't think we are that individualistic as sometimes claimed in this way of thinking, because the individualism also comes from communities.
Our final question for today is from Rajiv Ranjan. Can you elaborate the idea of polarizing infrastructure, which is related to new technology?
Well, new technology, the social media inherently create polarization. That's you can just see among young people how much problems it is with hate messages, and so I think we are quite conscious about this situation, and so I'm more worried about the polarizing effect of social media, and then the positive effects of them. That they also, of course, have. You could also look at the social media as social instruments that people have. You can see how much people enjoy it and so on. But from a democratic point of view, I think it's more the polarizing trend that is a problem.
Thank you so much, Professor, for such an enriching discussion. We apologize for not being able to take up all the questions due to the paucity of time. Now over to Christabel Royan for the final remarks.
Many thanks to you, Professor. Many thanks to you on behalf of Professor Bhaswati Sarkar and her team at the Center for European Studies at JNU and the Nordic Center in India, of which University of Oslo is a member. Many thanks to you for your erudite, temporal, and spatial exposition of civil society in the Nordic region. It was a very engaging lecture. We're very grateful for your time, and it's another successful end to another successful day of the Nordic Summer School. Many thanks to everybody for being present today. Good evening, Professor, and thank you once again for your time, and good night to everybody present here today in India. Thank you.
I see there is a lot of questions. Can you send them to me or something? So yeah, that would be good, because I sure would like to have a look to respond to them if possible.
Is somebody
we'll be able to do that.
The questions? Yeah, just could we just quickly copy the questions? Is somebody just going to take the chat? Yeah.
I will copy the questions and have them emailed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
I'll go ahead and end the meeting if that's okay with everybody.
No, have you copied it?
Please
No,
give me 2 more minutes, Christabel. I am just copying the rest of the questions.
No problem. No problem.
She's copying them.
Yeah.
Thank you, Christabel. I'm done.
Thank you. So we end today's lecture. Thank you all very much once again. And
thank you, everyone.
Tomorrow.
See you tomorrow. And also tomorrow there is the other link which has been sent out.
Yeah.
So just a reminder for that. That you need to log into this other link and attend the conference on higher education.
No, it's Nordic research collaboration.
Research collaboration. Yeah. So
all the science and innovation people are there for talking about which are the strategic research areas, and you can ask them questions, basically.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you tomorrow.